that God is sovereign, that he can grant limited sovereignty to his creatures? Or is that a contradiction?
That God, being sovereign, can grant limitless sovereignty to his creatures.
Limited sovereignty.
Limited sovereignty. Oh, not only do I think that is not a contradiction, I think that is absolutely so. And that's why humanity is defined often as being semi-transcendent. You are able to even make objective statements even of your own being. And there's a sovereignty given to us. It's more like a stewardship. It is a limited sovereignty, and a limited sovereignty given by a totally sovereign being are not mutually exclusive terms. For example, the moral law is given, but the freedom is given on how you respond to that moral law. But you're not free to change the entailments of how you respond to it. So there is limited sovereignty in the choices that we make, in the surrogate responsibilities that we have over the created order, over the degree to which we navigate with our reason, or with our choices, or how we respond to our emotions. I think the whole Genesis narrative, in fact, is precisely that, in giving us that limited sovereignty without the total sovereignty over the created order, where God alone is totally sovereign. That's the way I would see it, sir.
Thank you, sir. I learned that from you and from the Bible.
Thank you very much. I hope it's in reverse order. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Dr. Zacharias, I'm a counselor by profession, and as part of my professional code of ethics, it's understood that I allow what's called self-determination of a client and an individual choosing their own path, and am encouraged and in many ways vow to not impose or place my values upon that individual. What I struggle with is how to come to an understanding and a peace in that when I am, now I'll take it to the extreme, counseling a young woman who is considering abortion, when I value the sanctity of life, and yet in a professional code of ethics am counseled or encouraged to allow that individual her own choice. It seems to me that I am a hypocrite in my deepest heart of hearts when I don't, in some ways, communicate my understanding of reality with that individual.
There are two aspects to your question, and you're in a very tough situation, obviously. I respect the fact that you're struggling with it, especially with the illustration you give. So I remember when Robert Shapiro was being interviewed by Larry King after that infamous trial with the professional football player O.J. Simpson. I remember Larry King saying to Shapiro, he said, "Bob," he said, "what is the truth about what really happened there?" And he said, "Larry, I'm a lawyer in this case. I don't deal with the truth." He said, "I'm dealing with the best way that I can defend and protect my client." So he leaned over and Larry King said, "All right, Bob, what do you think really happened on that night?" And he said, "Larry, I do not make moral judgments. I only make professional judgments." What he was really saying was he had already made a moral judgment to be professional rather than moral. So when you make a decision that you're not imposing your views on somebody else, believe me, you are. You are imposing a view that will implicitly say that my view is that I have no right to impose my view on you, so that's the view I'm going to impose on you. That I have no right to impose my view on you. It is a position that is inescapable. Now, that's one side of the question. The other side of the question is this: are you in a situation where professionally you are mandated that you cannot rise to the level of your own values, otherwise you lose the prerogative of being in that position. In other words, if you're working for an agency that says we will hire you, but we will not allow you to counsel a person in such a situation in such and such a way, then I would have to say to you, then you are putting your moral convictions under the amoral convictions of other people, and you're probably in the wrong place. It is a tough situation in life. You know, I remember one of the political candidates, and I know this is volatile, and in an audience like this, some of you may have a different view, but I think you have to concede the underpinnings of this issue here. When one of the candidates for president made the comment that while he was personally against abortion, he would not impose his view on the rest of the nation. It sounded very nice, great grandstanding of nobility. You know, who am I to impose my view on you? But here's the question. Is that life within that mother's womb a life or not? If it is a life, why are you going to give permission for it to be removed? If it is not a life, why are you personally against it? And if you don't know the answer to the question whether it is a life or not a life, how many more decisions are we going to base on an agnostic platform that could be costing millions of lives? So it is one thing to say, this is my belief, and this is the way I would like to see our country go. If you do not want me to have that view, you have the right not to vote for me. But my belief is in the sanctity of life and the sanctity of human life in its essence, not just in its existence. So as tough as a situation you are in, sir, now I have to believe there are some issues that may not be of as weighty an importance, but since you've given the most weighty illustration, you have to make the choice for the preservation of life. Otherwise, you are in a self-defeating situation. I'll let you come back quickly and then move to the next question.
Well, the issue is that there are questions or moments that are less existential, but are still troubling to me, because I have a sense of the world and life and this individual in front of me's growth that is broader than a limited mortality.
Yeah, you have to evaluate your profession with your opinions and your convictions. Opinions are those which are negotiable. Convictions are those which, if you change who you are. So you have to go with the convictions that are deepest in your life, and if they are violated in the process of your profession, then you have to find the profession that will be secondary to your convictions, not overruling them. As I know that's easy to say, but it's tough. Yes, sir.
Hello,
Please,
Ravi.
yeah.
Hi. I listened to all your messages, by the way. You're my favorite speaker. My question for you today is, if transrational truth is the answer, as you said, then why do you think it's not ultimately and satisfactorily universally manifested, since that is so important?
The transcendental truth, you mean, where in the person of God, transcending humanity?
Like you said earlier, when you said that the answer is it not in secularism, but going beyond the world view, having God.
That's right. Why is it not universally accepted?
No, why is it not universally manifested in the reality that we live in?
Okay, if I'm understanding your question correctly, let me position it this way. Are you asking me if that is the way that it should be?
Correct.
Why is it not universally experienced or felt or sensed within humanity?
Exactly.
Okay. I think that's a very fair question. I think it's a good question. But it is felt. It is felt in strange ways. We do not realize it. For example, the strongest argument against the existence of God is that people say there is too much of evil in this world and too much of suffering, therefore there is no God. But can you not then see what is brought in through the back door in that question? Because if there's evil, there's good. If there's good, there has to be a moral law. If there's a moral law, there has to be a transcendent moral lawgiver, but that's whom the question is trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is the question, really? So the strongest argument against the existence of God actually assumes God in the question. So it is universally manifested. What actually happens is, your question is so profound if you really think about it. You have to sort of take off one layer at a time. So let me put it this way. When Paul stood before the Athenians, he spoke to them about the fact that they were religious within their worldview. They had all these places and altars for all kinds of gods, and just in case they'd missed any, they also put an unknown God. In India today, in the pantheon of Hinduism, there are 330 million deities. Islam, with its billion-plus followers, believes in a supreme being. Even Buddhism, though it is non-theistic in its essence, you will find them in strange ways sometimes talking about Buddha as if he is that transcendent eternal being with you. There is an inescapable, it's what I think Blake would call that disturbing presence that is there hovering over you. The problem comes not in the disregard for this ultimate reality. The problem comes in the particulars then that we start attributing to this reality and configure a worldview that is religious without worrying about the notion of testability and truth. You know, it is interesting. Richard Dawkins has gone the route of saying there's no such thing as good or evil. It is ultimately all of us dancing to our DNA. And in this whole field of neuroscience, which is possibly going to be the most significant discipline in years to come, people are talking about, is it all in our DNA? Is it all in our DNA? Is it all in our DNA? The more I pondered that, there's a lot we need to think about in that statement. Because if you go to some cultures where for centuries there's been a kind of idolatry, how can you expect somebody who in the 20th or 30th generation is suddenly going to dismantle and throw everything away from centuries of belief in a certain system of deities or whatever it is? And the more I pondered that, the more I came to the realization, if indeed it is in our DNA, partially, how much truer then is the statement that Jesus made that you must be born again? That only in the regeneration of God. The Bible says that God is spoken in the created order, that he is spoken in the inner voice of conscience, that he is spoken in the written revelation of his word, that through instrumentalities and through punctuated means God does speak. The problem is what Chesterton, for example, says. The problem with Christianity is not that it's been tried and found wanting, but that it's been found difficult and left untried. So we have sufficient data. Bertrand Russell, when he was asked why he disbelieved in God, he said, I would say to him, you did not give me enough evidence. The problem with Mr. Russell was not that he didn't have enough evidence, but it was the suppression of evidence that he engaged in all the time. I think God gives us enough of revelation in himself. Our problem is not that it is not manifested, but that we want to wrest it, to reinterpret it, and make ourselves completely sovereign over it. And that's, I think, the human heart.
Okay, and in response to that, you would say that, and finally, because man is innately evil, that's the reason why Christianity is found not true?
I think because man wants to retain complete sovereignty over himself. And the Christian faith calls for a surrender of your will to God. That's what it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes,
Early in your talk, you mentioned a example of a board of experts, and you had a pastor on there, and you said people would assume that the pastor was biased towards an issue because he was a pastor. Isn't that actually a fair assumption, since a pastor will approach any issue with pre-constructed conclusions on something? I'm told as a student that a bias is a bad thing because it clouds your judgment, but I can accept that a bias could be a good thing. Why could a bias be a good thing? Could it be fair to approach an issue with a bias?
Your question is very fair. That's why I didn't just state that, I put the counterpoint of it. Counterpoint being that they would assume that the pastor is biased, but that the others are all objective. That's what I said. They're all biased, but the pastor would be assumed to be biased with a capital B, and the others of them have sort of somehow retained some objectivity, and there's no personal agenda in the process. Your point is, not only is your point a good one, it's a very correct one, that we all bring some, rather than using the word bias, let's use the word prejudice, prejudge. But what do you prejudge by? You prejudge by a certain set of propositions. That is the paradigm that you've created for yourself. Now, the important thing to notice is this, that when your worldview is a Christian worldview, which I believe to be coherent, then you're not making ad hoc decisions as you go in a vacuum. You're making them on the basis of a worldview that is consistent in all of your judgments. The problem with the secularist is that it becomes an ad hoc judgment, precisely what Chesterton said. You lose your right to make any moral pronouncements because you have rejected the very claim to morality, and yet you make moral judgments in the process. So we all have prejudices, but those prejudices are prejudging something on the basis of a worldview that's been judged. And once you've established a worldview, how do you establish a worldview? You establish a worldview by answering 4 questions coherently. Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Where did I come from? How do I determine right from wrong? What gives life meaning? What is the end of life? You take these 4 questions, and each answer has to correspond to reality. And when all the 4 answers are given, there has to be a coherence to them. Some worldviews may answer one correctly, but the other incorrectly, and it becomes an incoherent worldview. Then you actually apply the tests of truth, things like logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance. These are the things that come to bear. So you take the questions of life, apply the tests of truth, that forms your worldview. That then gives you the worldview that has been judged correctly, which helps you to prejudge the particulars as you move along. So your point is well taken, but it's half of it. The others are also biased. The question is their worldview defensible by which they are making that judgment? That's the issue.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I agree with your concept of absolute truth. My problem is recognizing that truth. And further, when you say recognizing that truth from God, I would assume it would come as a piece of spirit, or the Spirit testifying, or whatever rhetoric you may use. How do you say to a Buddhist who has that peace or that recognition, or a Hindu or a Muslim who believe that they got that answer from that higher power, that theirs is not valid while the Christian's viewpoint is valid?
Very, very great question. And you're dealing, of course, with 2 levels of interaction. Level 1, that's why I think most of modern day attempts to communicate the person of Christ or the message of Christ falls on deaf ears, because it is going through a paradigm that has not yet been challenged. For example, if a Hindu legitimately believes in his mind that all religions are right, that there's no one way to God, no matter what you say about Christ, he or she will add it to that paradigm. They just almost, it's sort of sucking in every worldview, because the scaffolding says it has a rightness to it and fits in with the rest of what I believe. I don't have to disbelieve anything in order to believe this. Suppose the Hindu believed that. Then to give the particulars of Christ is only to add to an erroneous worldview. We in America at a certain stage could talk about Christ without any such entanglement of other worldviews, and the person would understand it. In a few minutes they say, I now fathom it, what do I do, how do I get right with God, and so on. But we are now in the complexity of a pluralistic and a relativistic culture with many worldviews in the mix. And if you do the communication of truth without understanding the other worldview, it'll really be falling on deaf ears. And I think it is absolutely imperative that the communication of truth today should first be in terms of the worldview of the individual, that you understand it. For example, when I talk to, I go to India at least 2 or 3 times a year. I speak to large Hindu audiences. And this recently when I was there, some well-known film actors, big name icons were in my audience. And they were listening very, very carefully. And at the end of it, one of them said to me, one of them actually literally came and fell at my feet. I picked him up. I said, no, please don't do that. He said, I really need to talk to you. There is so much I have believed over the years that I don't know why I've believed. He understood what I was saying was that if something is added here, something will have to be subtracted from what we believe. So when we say our absolute is based on the Judeo-Christian worldview, and you're talking to a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu who does not subscribe to the worldview, there's no point really talking to them about absolutes without first talking to them about why they believe what they believe. And so it involves a two-step process. You cannot convey, and here's the point. Jesus Christ didn't come into this world to make bad people good. He came into this world to make dead people live. We are dead to God. Being more moral is not going to, D.L. Moody used to say, if a man is stealing nuts and bolts from a railway track and you send him to college, at the end of his education, he will steal the whole railway track. Giving absolutes is not going to change a person's life. What we need to do is find the basis of the absolute, and that's where I think true communication of absolutes presupposes a worldview that needs to be in place. I think that's very important. It's tough. It's tough. And I've seen students actually I remember at Cornell, a young woman came up to me and said, I am living with a naturalistic framework every waking moment. What you have said to me today has shattered the foundations of my framework. Where do I start? And Christ is a shatterer of foundations. He's a shatterer of foundations. You take Buddhism, for example. Buddhism and Hinduism are very different. People don't realize that. We put them both in the pantheistic framework, but I'm sure you realize they're so different. Gautama Buddha was born a Hindu, and he rejected the caste system and he rejected the Vedas. When you talk to a Buddhist, karma is very different to talking to a Hindu. The law of karma in Buddhism is a non-transference of the ego with every incarnation. The ego does not come through. The karma emerges, but the ego does not. It is the survival of the karma, not the individual, which is a very different view to taking, say, the Hindu karmic pattern, where there may be transference of the ego in some way as one goes from life to the transmigration of a soul, not of karma. There is an accretion, but the soul, as it were, is transmigrated. So I remember talking to a woman in Bangkok who was the first woman to be ordained in Buddhism in Thailand. She was a PhD from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and went back to Thailand, and she had to go to Sri Lanka to be ordained. And I remember as I kept pinning her on question after question after question, there were two things she struggled with. Number one, that to truly attain nirvana, she had to renounce every attachment in the world. I said, so ma'am, your advice to me today is that really I should turn my back upon my wife and my children. Is that what you're asking me to do? Because that's what you've done to your family. Her lips quivered and the tears started to run down her face. I kid you not. She said, I still struggle with it. She never answered me. And then a few other questions, she came out with another startling response. To her, only in the end of our 3 hours did I tell her how I came to know Christ in my life. She was silent at that time. Worldview evangelism is here today, and the absolute into a relativistic world that just adds without subtracting is to leave the absolute relativized after you're finished. It doesn't work. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You talked about three shifts in our society: the pluralization, the secularization, and privatization. And I'm wondering, what is the way? How do we, as a church, respond to that? Do we respond to one of those three first? And my sense is that we're sort of complicit in privatization. The message I get a lot from Christianity is that the work that I do in and of itself has no intrinsic value to God, and that this creation itself has no intrinsic value to God. It's simply a place for us to be while we make our choice between for God or against God.
Not only are we sometimes complicit with the secularization and the privatization, we're also complicit sometimes with postmodernism. And unfortunately, we have bought into this idea today, if you can make everybody feel happy at the end of the hour, you've accomplished your purpose. When in some instance, you might want to make them feel most uncomfortable at the end of the hour so that we get on and do some things that are meaningful. We've forgotten to bridge this with this. And that is unfortunately what has happened. You know, I've got a couple of friends here who are in seminaries who are philosophers. And they'll probably tell you today there's a tremendous interest in philosophy in the Christian community today. And some colleges are getting an overflow of applicants, young men and women wanting to go in that discipline because they want to think. And the church should be the place where they do their best thinking. And, you know, the best sense of commitment, evoking their wills. So I would say to you, yes, it happens, and unfortunately it has. This is the biggest challenge when you go to university campus and somebody says, where do I go to church tomorrow? And you say, well, you know, your choices may be limited, but we need to find a place where they can do their thinking legitimately and think God's thoughts after Him. We can be complicit sometimes without meaning to be, and it's very unfortunate, and in privatization. Now, we have to be careful. The Christian faith is vulnerable. Unlike some worldviews, for example, Islam is by definition an intrusive faith. When you're in the Middle East and in Islamic countries, the muezzin wakes you up at sunrise whether you want to wake up or not. You may be in a hotel room and his loudspeaker is blaring. He's waking you up. If you go to some parts where I was in the Middle East, when during Ramadan, you can't hold a bottle of water in public. You could be whisked off and questioned. In other places where I've been, if you convert from that faith to the Christian faith, you have to stand before a tribunal. You have judges to answer it, while the reverse doesn't hold true. So there's an intrusiveness in it. I don't know how it can be denied. But the Christian faith doesn't intrude that way. The Christian faith is, in religious terminology, a little bit as vulnerable as democracy is in the political terminology. There is the freedom to disbelieve. And so we do become vulnerable. And in a mixed society, sometimes we simply cannot overtly expect a mixed society to grant us all of our wishes that we would like to have. And in some instances, we like to have more than probably we should. But where I think we've gone wrong is that in the intellectual arena where there should be an openness to the defense of the Christian faith, that's where we've been blocked out illegitimately. When places like Harvard and all were being run by evangelicals, the liberal scholar was made welcome. Now when the liberals take hold, the evangelical is evicted. It's very interesting. When liberalism is supposed to cut a wide swath, it can become very bigoted. So that's where I think we belong. In terms of the mainstream of culture and government and all, there has to be some accommodation of other worldviews, and that makes it vulnerable there. Is there anybody here who has a contrary question? You've all been very kind. I want to know if there's somebody who's got a counterpoint to make. Well, okay, then we'll give you the first choice. Go over to the microphone.
Dr. Zacharias, I'm kind of nervous. First of all, there are a lot of people in this audience, and if you can't answer this question right now, I totally understand, but we're in Salt Lake City, Utah, and you're talking about absolute truth. And I'm wondering, in comparison, I have two questions. First, Christianity in comparison to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One, do both of those religions have an absolute truth, which I believe they do? And two, do they contradict one another, and how?
I have a friend who's going to answer that question. No, just kidding. So let me preface it with a few comments, and then I'll do my best to answer your question. First, I am a guest, all right? And I do a lot of speaking in countries that hold a completely different worldview to mine. I speak at Islamic universities, Hindu universities, no. In India, we have a proverb. There's two ways to touch your nose. You can touch it this way or touch it the long way around. So in many of our answers, we have to touch it the long way around, okay? Are there differences between the two? Absolutely. fundamental difference between the two. I met with leaders yesterday in the morning, and as we were walking out, we chatted that we have two different theological systems, two different philosophical bases. To deny that would be to live in an illusion. We recognize that. As a Christian, to me, the final authority is the Bible and the incarnation, the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And I will always be willing to defend that, what the Bible teaches, who Jesus Christ was. Obviously, in the Latter-day Saints, there are other authorities that are brought in, and some of their doctrines, therefore, are very different and may even be contradictory to what we believe. Does that contradiction remove the possibility of dialogue? No. You have to be able to patiently listen and understand and give the opposing view a chance to defend its own worldview. I am committed to the authority of the Scriptures and the completeness and the work of Jesus Christ, and I will always defend that. If anyone wants to bring other dimensions to it, I'm very content to sit across the table and ask some hard questions and see whether a proper defense of it can be made. There are differences, we know it, and we recognize it. I had lunch with 7 faculty members yesterday at Brigham Young. I lectured at the philosophy department at BYU 10 years ago. They were very kind in inviting me there. And they knew my position would be that of an evangelical Christian, and I respected them for letting me come. Was I going to therefore go and attack the contrary worldview? No, I was going to uphold and defend mine. And a person who's thinking can put it beside what they believe, and then they will have to measure whether its facts then override what the listener believes, and if so, how can the two be dealt with at that point? The world, the foundational epistemology is different, the foundational authority is different, and therefore some emergent doctrines are different. And my prayer is that in a world where we can peaceably disagree, we ought not to be disagreeable. And my goal in life is ultimately to preach Christ till when he is lifted up, he will draw all men unto him. And that'll be the best answer I can give. Thank you. Yes, sir.
First, I want to thank you for coming here tonight. I felt very honored to be able to sit and listen to you speak.
Thank you.
My question has to do with George Bush and him saying that he's a Christian, but yet, attacking Iraq, killing, Iraqis, children, men, women, and I just see that as a very splintered, viewpoint on just what he says, or when he says that he's moral.
Okay. Fair enough. I have met him. I've chatted briefly with him. I've received letters from him after he's read 1 or 2 of my books, commented on it. I have been hosted there by 2 or 3 very close associates of his. And I won't go beyond that except to say we know some, they will share with me some inside tracks of what it is that his life is like in his private life. When you make decisions for a world where killing is already going on, you ought not to then think that my intervening in a situation is creating the killing. Sometimes interventions are made to stop the killing. I have very close friends in Iraq. My wife and I were with one man who came out of Iraq who told me and told us over lunch he was trained to do 2 things: to kill people without feelings and to make false passports. I was with a pastor who is in Baghdad. My colleague Nate, who travels with me all the time, will tell you, he sat across the table and wept. They used to have 3 onions to share between 5 people for dinner every night with some bread. Some of the pita bread and onions, hardly anything. He said, this is the first time in my life I can go to church, and there's a sign above the church that says Jesus is the light of the world, and the church is packed. what you are saying is a very legitimate question. It's a very painful reality. I was in my 20s when I was in Vietnam. I didn't go there as a military man. I went there as a guest of the chaplains, and I was speaking to our troops. I was speaking to our troops in other parts of the world recently. They will tell you what they have seen with their own eyes is such carnage that for the world to have stepped back and done nothing would have been a crime of the worst kind. When I was in the Middle East years ago when Israel took the preemptive strike and destroyed the nuclear reactor in Baghdad. Think of what would have happened if that step had not been taken years ago now. So I say to you very kindly, sir, your question is a very good one, and it's a very painful one. There are no simple answers, but I put yourself in this situation. If you walked into a room where your mother or your sister was being raped, and your only choice was to disable the man who was raping them or to let them continue raping them, what would your choice be? Yep. Yeah. And I think President Bush reads the situation that sooner or later you'd be fighting that battle either here or there. And I'll tell you what, I had letters from and comments from people in Iran, in Iraq, in Lebanon. My wife and I had lunch with a man from Iran 2 weeks ago, the Sunday before the election, and at a table he said to us, I do not understand what's going on in America. Why would they even think that Bush ought never to have intervened to protect what was going on there? I was driving in the United Arab Emirates 4 weeks ago when the Pakistani taxi driver turned to me and in Hindi said, I want you to know how grateful I am for President Bush and what he has done for us. I said, would you repeat that in English so my other companions hear? I'm not living in an illusionary world. Today, as the fighting goes on in Fallujah, every time I look at it, my heart aches. Somebody's son is dying. Somebody's brother is dying. But after Saddam were coming Uday and Qusay, who would have made Saddam look like a backyard scrap compared to what they have been. So the decision is made as a world leader, and the entailments are tough. So the choice is not killing people or not killing people. What do you do to stem the line of killing? And I'll give you a counterpoint here.
I'm just looking at, we sold Saddam weapons until the 90s.
Yeah.
We put him into power.
That's right. Yeah.
And I mean, to me, it's a very, exactly. I mean, I see in South America what was happening during the 80s. You had, we trained people to go down to South America, and it's like all corporate and corporations that are doing this.
I hear what you're saying, and many times the monsters of our own creation. But let me tell you this. The world has become so complex, and this whole idea of weaponry has become the biggest market there is. They're coming out of Europe, they're coming out of France, they're coming out of Germany, and if you see all the nonsense that goes on in the trafficking between Europe and the Middle East too, no country's hands are clean. And the question then remains, because one mistake has been made, does a second one also have to be made? Does my heart not hurt for the Iraqis who are being tortured and killed? Or do I stand off and say, it's not my son, my daughter, therefore we don't do anything? It is not an easy question, sir. It is not. And I appreciate the tender heart with which you're asking it. But I think the media needs to cut a little more slack for a world leader right now who is having to make the most difficult decisions, not because he wants to, but because there are parameters that he's seeing. I will tell you this, and I may run the risk of saying some pretty risky things here. Radical Islam, of the kind of the jihadists, is not going to stop. By their own words, by their own pronouncements. If you read the words of Bana and all of these guys, their own people are being killed in the process. In my book, Light in the Shadow of Jihad, I've listed great men, great Muslim men who've been slaughtered by the radicals. You take Ali Dashti, who was an Iranian journalist. And he wrote the book 23 Years, The Life of the Prophet Muhammad, raised some tough questions, he vanishes off the face of the earth, where you're not even allowed to raise a question and you're killing your own. So the question is there anybody in the world who's going to take a stand and say, you're not going to do this to the rest of civilization, and it is going to cost our lives? There are some things more important than life, and that is the upholding of truth. And we may have to pay the price. I go into these places, sometimes I never know if I'm going to come back alive. Keep praying that God will give wisdom. I know it's a tough scene, but I tell you what, backing away from it is not going to stop the killing. It's just somebody else's sons and daughters who are being killed, and we're going to step back and say, it's not my own. It's not an easy choice. The world needs a statesman, and I think we don't have it. All the shenanigans that are going on in Europe right now just leave one bankrupt. But tough question. In my book, Light in the Shadow of Jihad, I have addressed this from a different angle. I encourage you to pick it up. Yes, sir. I tell you what, we've got quickly. Yes, sir.
In your talk, you spoke of the importance of absolutes, absolute truth. And I think the reason behind that being that worldviews make a difference. Some
Right.
worldviews are closer to reality than others.
Right.
And since we live in reality, that's important. You also spoke of pluralism being a good thing in the culture, having multiple viewpoints, and a pluralistic government to some degree. I was wondering, how would you understand if a person, an individual, has to make his decisions from a worldview and should make his decisions from a worldview that's closer to reality, a government also has to make decisions from the perspective of some worldview, some end, some goal,
That's right.
Some values. How do you combine a democratic, pluralistic government that says it's not going to say what's right and wrong, it's going to allow the people as a whole to say that, it's not going to it's going to have a separation of some established worldview in its operation, and so in effect it's not going to come from a particular perspective, but yet
I think I hear what you're saying.
How do you combine the concern for pluralism in the government and in our culture with a concern for a worldview being closer to reality than others and needing to have a correct worldview guiding us?
When the early philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so on, they actually believed good politicians had to be very good philosophers because good philosophical thinking is needed. And so in a democracy, while there are pluralistic views, what is interesting is that today the media attacks only one who has a worldview with the supernatural in mind. They're intolerant of that worldview. So they themselves that offer relativism do not offer you the freedom to hold your view. So they themselves, in effect, hold to an absolute that excludes the exclusivists. And when that happens, what they are doing is going as relativists, but actually holding an absolute within their own worldview and denying anyone with a counter perspective to navigate with those worldviews as well. I remember speaking to the United Nations opening day this year, the UN opening day of prayer, and they asked me to speak on navigating with absolutes in a relativistic world. It's a tough subject at 7:30 in the morning. And yet I gave 3 or 4 points on which they would have to navigate, things like justice, things like love, things like forgiveness, and the reality of evil, which we all somehow bring these. And I pointed them to the cross, that only in the cross did these realities ultimately converge. So what we need in a democracy is for every person who has the privilege of voting to vote for the person whose worldview will legitimately inform the decisions that we make in government. And in a democracy, we realize there will be others with contrary worldviews as well who may emerge with their opposite perspective. One cannot exclude the opposite. What is happening in America is that we want to exclude the Christian, specifically the Christian. When I go to university campuses, nobody would mock me if I spoke on Buddhism. Nobody would mock me if I speak on Hinduism or Islam. But the professors want to take you to task if you're talking about the Christian worldview. And so what I'm pleading for is in the marketplace of ideas, the Christian worldview should be given its viable legitimacy. And as we prepare men and women, the best thing you and I can do if we've got young people in our midst, train them to be good thinkers. Train them to be good articulators of what they believe. And when it is well articulated, you trust the grace of God that the society listening to you will see the reasonableness of what you're saying and not go in the wrong direction where the other worldview may survive. Yes, sir.
The young lady who spoke earlier, I sort of have to rephrase my question after hearing her, because this has to do with how we publish ourselves, how we present ourselves as Christians to those who have opposing views, opposing faiths. It basically comes out of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4, another Jesus, another Spirit, another gospel. When I hear you tonight, what you're saying is the law of non-contradiction applies even on that verse. And therefore, no matter who it is that says Jesus, Jesus cannot be, like Arius said, a created being and be the creator at the same time. So the law of non-contradiction applies. In your writing on these kind of subjects, do we as Christians, as we formulate tracts, is it our duty as apologists to put the message out to the point that the law of non-contradiction becomes apparent to the person who would read a simple gospel tract that we would hand out on the street, to where the bridging between the mind and the heart, as you said earlier, gives them a confrontation of sorts in their own soul, to where they say, I've got to make a decision. Something's wrong in my following of what I call Jesus, whether it's an Arian, Sabellian, modalist, or whatever, and what I see as reality in the Scriptures. Do you apply the law of non-contradiction in your writings that way?
Yeah, the answer to that would be yes, I do apply the law of non-contradiction. Let me address your question, because I agree. I think it's a good one when you're talking with someone who may have a different caricature of the very name or person or view that you may hold. I don't think the problem is that there is a difference in what you're communicating to the person. I think the important thing is how you communicate it. In India, we have a proverb saying there's no point cutting off a person's nose and then giving them a rose to smell. You know, what is the point coming with guns blazing and saying God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life? Yeah, you just can't intimidate the person. I'll tell you what, I think one of the reasons God gives us children is to keep us humble. You learn very quickly how you deal with kids, and you deal with them sometimes not the way you want to deal with them, but on the way and the time they are responsive to what it is you're saying. It is not only what you're saying, but how you say it. It is so interesting. When you look at Matthew and Mark, for example, or Mark and John, they don't even tell us the virgin birth story. They don't even give the Sermon on the Mount. Was it not important? I think they had a purpose in what they were writing, and yet all four Gospels have a large percentage devoted to the passion of our Lord, which is the heart of the Gospel. So when you're dealing with people, I think you have to deal purposefully. What is important at this time to help the person understand? I've done that all my life, and nobody asked me to do it, nobody taught me to do it. I sometimes go back to universities in the Middle East where I wonder why they're asking me back, and yet I've got letters from people out there who will tell you that it was a talk you gave or an illustration you gave or a book you wrote that changed my life and helped me to see Christ the way I'd never seen him before. So I think it is not only important what we are saying, but how we say it. And that is the key. So I say to you, the law of non-contradiction applies to reality, but that does not mean that it is an intimidation to the listener. The way Jesus handled the woman at the well is a classic. How he took her from the distant to the nearer, to the proximate, to the personal, till she says, come and see the one who told me everything I did. And is basically saying, but who accepted me. And I think it's key. Leave that with you. Yes, sir. Two more.
Good evening, Ravi. When it comes to the nature of God, did God ever have to bow to objective, absolute morality external to himself to become absolute and transcendent for us? So in other words, did God ever, is it even possible for God to have to surrender his will to somebody who is sovereign over him?
The answer to that is no.
Okay.
Because it is forcing a false dichotomy. It is forcing, there's a technical philosophical term for doing this. What you're really doing is making the objective moral law as something apart from God. It is not. It is intrinsic to his nature. And God cannot not be. It is impossible for God to not be. He eternally exists. He is uncaused. He is infinite. He is non-dependent. And intrinsic to his character is that there is nothing self-destructive in him. And anything contrary to his being would self-destruct. So it is not that the moral law stands over and above him, or he stands above the moral law in a fiat way, just decreeing. What God had joined together, let no man put asunder. It is the moral law that is intrinsic to his nature. It is not possible for God to lie, because the lie would be a self-destructive thing in him. So the moral framework emerges from his person and is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's an interesting metaphor that he uses. That propositional truth that emerged from him was identical to his very being. And therefore, it is forcing a disjunction that is not there in the eternal entity of God's very moral being.
Could we also say that our very nature is to be as well, and that our nature is also intrinsically morally absolute?
We are, first of all, we are finite, and it is not an univocal comparison between God's nature and God's being and our being. But to answer your question, the moral law does stand over and above us, and the moral law ultimately cannot change us. It only takes God, who by the regenerative power of our hearts takes that which is bent towards evil and transforms it into that which seeks to worship and glorify him. So if our nature, if you want to use the word absolute, I would just say we are absolutely trapped in our sin. And it only takes the moral being of God to change the inclination of the heart, so that he doesn't only change what you do, he changes what you want to do. Okay. Last question. Yes, sir.
The question I have is, as dependent as we are on absolutes, I'm glad my bank statement is not relative, or my work hours or anything like that. Why is there such hostility to ours, considering some of the absolutes that are even more, they're imposed in the Islamic world, but they're very friendly to that, but there's hostility towards the Christian view, as if absolutes are wrong, but we want the corporations to report accurately on their stuff. I mean, all these things have to be so. Why is it so hostility to our point of view as far as because it affects our lives as well? Because even if God had given us 10 ways to him, we would have wanted 11. As Soren Kierkegaard says, the essence of pleasure is having it my way. We thought Frank Sinatra and the others introduced that. Kierkegaard talked about it, that you want to have it your way. Now, Chesterton made a very profound comment. He said, I do not want a religion that is only right where I am right. I need a religion that is also right where I am wrong. And that's where the rub comes. The reason we resist absolutes that God gives to us is because we would rather have it where we are sovereign over all decisions and all judgment. When Augustine wrote his City of God, he wept because he saw the walls of Rome scaled and the city destroyed. What he tells us is that if we don't go back to the way God intended us to be, we will always build the cities of men that will self-destruct, rather than building the city of God that will stand the test of time.
We want to do it our way because we want the prerogative of total sovereignty. But you know what? David, who did it his way, wrote a magnificent verse in the Psalms. To all perfection there is a limit, but the laws of the Lord are boundless. What he's really saying is, if you do it God's way, there's unmatched terrain ahead of you, marvelous. If you do it your way, there's a limit. So he reverses the analogy. We think if we go with God's laws, we are bound. If we do it our way, there's freedom. He says, oh no, been there, done that. He says, if you do it God's way, there's eternal terrain to enjoy, perpetual novelty. If you do it your way, you end up in solitude and servitude. It's the inclination of the heart. And that's why when you find Christ, you find what it is to be complete in him. Let me end with this statement here. And Daniel Yankelovich, in that article, ends with this after surveying numerous couples across the country. This is a brilliant way to end. He interviewed a couple called Abby and Mark. Listen to what he says. If you feel it is imperative to fill all your needs, and if these needs are contradictory, or in conflict with those of others, or simply unfillable, then frustration inevitably follows. To Abby and to Mark as well, self-fulfillment means having a career, and marriage, and children, and sexual freedom, and autonomy, and being liberal, and having money, and choosing nonconformity, and insisting on social justice, and enjoying city life, and country living, and simplicity, and graciousness, and reading, and good friends, and on and on. He says the individual is not truly fulfilled by becoming ever more autonomous. Indeed, to move too far in this direction is to risk psychosis, the ultimate form of autonomy. Then he says this, the injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. Yankelovich could have saved millions of dollars if he'd read the New Testament, because that's what it tells you. He that comes up to me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And that's where self-fulfillment comes with his absolute. Thanks, folks. God bless you.